For now, though, for a wider look at road safety, we are joined by Eugene Herbert, who's the CEO of Master Drive. Thank you so much for joining us, Eugene. It's really a pleasure having you, but obviously not an easy discussion that we're having here this evening. 16 people. 16 people having lost their lives in this bus crash. And then just, within the past few days, we've been looking at another bus crash in KwaZulu-Natal that claimed 9 lives. I mean, it's just harrowing what we're seeing here. Are there any synergies here that you see? Is there something that needs to be looked at in your view in the bus industry, in the busing industry?
Thank you, Naledi, and thank you for allowing us to have this chat. Firstly, condolences to the victims of the bus crash, because the unintended consequences of somebody's action has resulted in loss to them. So our condolences. But sadly, as you mentioned, the bus crash earlier in KZN is but just 2 examples of what happens on a fairly regular basis. When we see and we start analyzing the statistics, the fatalities that occur as a result of a bus crash is actually quite exponential, because it's not just the crash, there's multiple injuries, and of course the consequences of that are rather sad. What we do see is that there's probably a common cause amongst many of the crashes. There could be fatigue. I'm not saying it is the case, and certainly in this instance it doesn't necessarily appear to be so, but inadequate training, a lack of law enforcement. And of course, when you see, and I've driven the road, for example, from Johannesburg to Cape Town frequently, the buses are supposed to be traveling at a maximum of 100 kilometers an hour, and yet you see them exceeding that speed. Now, I'm not saying speed is the cause of it, but inappropriate speed for the circumstances contributes to things such as this.
Yeah. And I wonder if there are mechanisms in place. So we can talk about speed, and then we'll even get into roadworthiness. But let's sit with speed. Are there mechanisms in place for bus operators to keep a close eye on it, to monitor, speed and how the driver behavior may impact how they operate?
A very good question. And in today's world, with the technology that's available, there's no excuse not to be able to see what the driver is doing at any given time. Because with telematics and a host of other things, you can not only be present in the bus, as it were, but you can see what the driver is seeing, and you can actually view the driver from a camera. Now, it's all very well having that information, but if it's not used appropriately, what good is it? So many of these companies invest in technology, but we can question whether or not they use it in the manner to change driver behavior. And let's accept the fact that the statistics, international and local, show that the common cause of crashes is, to the greater percentage, bad driving behavior. Now, if I can just go back to this bus incident in Ekurhuleni, from what I've read, it appears that a motorist, it was possibly a bakkie, made a wrong turn. The driver of the bus took evasive action, and as a result of that, the bus overturned. Now, you can question whether or not the driver of the bus had the skills, but think about what motorists do today. It's gross lack of adherence to the law. What that driver did, if that's the truth, shouldn't have happened, but the driver did that. And of course, when we think of the lack of experience and the number of people who are driving on our roads whose licenses are absolutely not worth the paper that they printed on. So it's a combination of factors that contribute toward these crashes. But having said that, if you as a bus operator accept responsibility for carrying the lives of people, then you should be adhering to the law, not only the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And I think in some of the engagement, and I'm glad to say that not all fall into this category, we've engaged with some of them that have been proactive. They wish to be the leaders in road safety when it comes to transportation of passengers, but by and large, it's not necessarily true.
Yeah. And then we've talked about behavior, but let's get into roadworthiness and, the checks that need to be in place there. If we go back to the bus accident in KwaZulu-Natal that saw 9 people lose their lives on the N2 between Mandeni and Stanger, church members that were traveling there, authorities saying that this was as a result of a burst tire. I mean, this is something that one would need to be checking tire pressure. So how do we explain that?
I can't comment as to whether the tire was the cause, but going back to your earlier comment, the overall roadworthiness of vehicles, there's a publication that does regular checks. They conduct roadside inspections, as it were, on vehicles, be it buses and the like. And by and large, and I think the figure is something like 65% of the vehicles that are pulled over by the authorities and checked, just on brakes, for example, are found to be unroadworthy. Now, when you mention the case of a tire, yes, we know that there's those, in the case of a bus, 6 patches of rubber that the bus is driving on, and that really is what keeps the bus on the road. Now, there is, or there should be, provision for that bus before it leaves depot for all of those things to have been done. We know, of course, that potholes, and that's another issue on our roads, do cause damage to tires. So without presuming that that was the case, we must accept that operators could and should be doing more to make sure that their vehicles are roadworthy. Some of the bus incidents that we've read about over the years, when you see what condition the bus was, certainly it leaves a lot to be desired. And those individuals who are responsible for that, we know of one instance, I think it was last year, where the bus driver, the operator, had a crash. He couldn't cope with it, and I'm told that he ran away from the scene, and he was later found that he had hanged himself. The awful responsibility that rests on the driver. So again, I go back to, and that's something we're very familiar with, the need to train drivers properly. But having said that, roadworthiness contributes significant amount of crashes, not only in the bus industry, but in other vehicles as well.
Yeah. Give us a few recommendations, Eugene, and I'm talking now especially for authorities, whether that be in how they are able to oversee what bus operators are doing, or even, I mean, there's a question on whether or not police visibility actually works, right? But what do we put on the table as this is what needs to happen so that we don't lose lives like this again?
Again, a very astute observation, because I'm sure you'll agree that the greater the presence of law enforcement on the road, the less likely it is that people will break the law, and in particular speed. We know when there's increased visibility by law enforcement, then motorists tend to behave themselves, and that's a universal phenomena. But if I could plead one thing, and this applies, I know that there's suggestions in routine that speed limits should be reduced for other vehicles. There should be an elimination, or blood alcohol levels should be 0. Any of those laws. Now, let's face it, South Africa has some really good laws, but it's the lack of adherence to those laws that causes the problems. Why is there lack of adherence? Because there's lack of enforcement. And you speak to many motorists, you know, the proverbial lunch money or the Coke is a reason for the law enforcement to turn a blind eye to the problems that a motorist encounters, whether that's the vehicle is unroadworthy, and we've seen some blatant instances where even not only the tires, but the vehicle is dripping oil, causing a danger to other road users. But think about it, if an individual is guilty of speeding or driving under the influence, these are all things that can be controlled better by law enforcement. But the lack of training that law enforcement has and the lack of will, combine that with the corruption that we see evident, and I'm not saying it's unique to South Africa, but these are the things that could be different. And if you couple that with an acceptance that every road user bears responsibility for proper behavior on the road. It's not law enforcement, it's not the vehicle, it's not the boss, and it's not the company. It's you and I who drive these vehicles. And if we take a bus driver, for example, or a truck driver, if they honestly, but they must be prepared to have the courage of their convictions, if that vehicle is unroadworthy, to speak up and say something and do something about it, because that will make a difference.
Yeah, Eugene, thank you so much for reminding us of those incredibly important points that we need to really be holding top of mind as we use our roads, devastating those 16 families going to bed heartbroken tonight after that bus accident in Ekurhuleni. 9 families reeling in KwaZulu-Natal. Eugene Herbert, their CEO of Master Drive, speaking to us. You're still watching Newsfeed PM, the late edition. We've got more news on the other side of this short break. Stay tuned.